Astronomy in Reverse by Pansley. Chapter 13. A Father's Love. He follows Steve wordlessly through the stretch of hallway leading away from Peter's room until they come to the door at the end of the hall and Steve opens it, waving him in. Bucky enters, unsurprised to see a bedroom as impersonal as his and Peter's are, the bed untouched as if Steve hasn't so much as sat down on it yet. Bucky moves out of the way and stands there as Steve steps in, shutting the door behind him. They haven't been alone together since those few minutes on the plane, so Bucky eyes him, not really knowing what to expect, finding it difficult to place the expression on the other man's face. Steve looks tired, but also like there's something he needs to say. Can't rest until he does. "I'm sorry." Bucky looks at him sharply, caught off guard. "What?" "I'm sorry," Steve says again earnestly, locking eyes with him. "I'm not trying to coddle you. I didn't mean for it to seem like I was." There's a thread of something in his voice that doesn't sit well with Bucky at all.
"So you don't think I'm dangerous?"
he asks dubiously, letting the "for Peter" go unsaid, knowing Steve realized it was implied. Steve's face tightens into an uncomfortable grimace, fighting with himself not to avert his gaze. "I'm not sorry for what I said," he says slowly, reluctant. "I'm sorry for how I said it."
"Oh."
The word hangs between them for a moment, neither man really knowing what to do with it. Steve shifts on his feet before plopping on the edge of the bed with a sigh, head bowed. "I've had to convince myself that you've changed, that you're not the same person you were 70 years ago. A rueful smile crosses his face, but there's something undeniably tortured in his expression. "But I shouldn't treat you like you're fragile, either. You would have punched me for that back then."
"I'm tempted to punch you for it now, if that makes you feel better,"
Bucky says, and can't keep the slight grin off his face when Steve looks up at him, one eyebrow raised, before his own smile breaks across his face, and they both chuckle, diffusing the tension somewhat. Bucky sighs and takes the seat beside Steve on the bed, a sudden nervousness overtaking him. It's dizzying to actually be here sitting beside Steve, laughing at a joke together. It somehow feels wrong, like he's breaking a reel going against the current. There's a coil of anxiety constricting in his stomach, but Bucky steals his expression and pushes down the urge to flee.
"I know you don't think I can handle it,"
he says, keeping his gaze facing forward.
"But I've been handling it for a year, and not with much difficulty for that matter."
He can't help the quirk at the corner of his lips, the proud smile that surfaces.
"Peter's a good kid. That has a lot to do with it."
"It's just hard to process," Steve says honestly, clasping his hands together in his lap. 2 years ago, I found out you were alive and what Hydra had done to you, and then you disappeared, and I spent all my time tracking down every base, every agent I could find, expecting to find you taken prisoner again somewhere. But you were in Queens, living in an apartment with a teenager who calls you Dad." Steve turns his head and looks at him deeply, like he's searching his face for any hint that he's not really Bucky. He lifts a hand and Bucky goes very still, watching, eyes honed in on the man's fingers as they lightly brush against the long hair falling across his shoulder. Their eyes meet as Steve says, "I thought I would never see you again." Bucky swallows, turning his head away, letting Steve drop his hand. He knows it must have been hard for him to have Bucky come back from the dead, but to hear the grief so vividly in his voice makes him feel sick with guilt. Steve, composing himself, says, "I'm trying to understand. I really am."
"I know,"
Bucky replies softly, a part of him screaming that he shouldn't say so much, and the rest of him aching to tell Steve everything. He feels defensive over the last 2 years of his life, of the memories he's made and the things he's been through. They weren't perfect, but they're his. They're his memories and his experiences. And something deep inside him desperately wants to keep them safe, protected. But he also wants Steve to know.
"It's been a long couple of years, Steve. I was purely relying on my instincts for that first year after DC."
Steve is tense, but he shifts slightly beside him, opening up, and Bucky can practically feel how much the other man is hanging on every word he's saying, so he continues.
"I didn't really have a plan. I was just going with the basics. Acquire shelter, food, and then an income. I worked odd jobs, got by on donations, scavenged for the rest. I wasn't really thinking about anything beyond survive and lay low so Hydra can't find me."
A somewhat hurt look crosses Steve's face, but he doesn't say anything. Bucky tries, but can't keep the smile off his face as he says,
And then one night, I was walking home and I heard some commotion in an alleyway. I started walking towards it before I even knew what I was doing, and there was this kid.
The smile widens, he can't help it. The joy of getting to tell the story of how Peter and he met for the first time.
This small, scrawny, stupidly brave kid, taking on a whole gang of punks in his pajamas and a homemade mask. He was holding his own, but it was pretty obvious he had no idea what he was doing.
Steve's face softens, the way Bucky thought it might.
I didn't want to get involved, but then one of the guys pulled a gun on the kid and he froze. I moved without thinking, let the gun fire into my hand to block the shot. And then I found out that he took on all these guys to try and get someone else's wallet bag. And all I could think was, what's wrong with me? How do I always end up finding these selfless, reckless little punks with no sense of self-preservation whatsoever?
They share a laugh before Bucky eagerly carries on.
I didn't want anything more to do with him at first. He followed me home and I pretty much slammed the door in his face. I already felt like I had taken a stupid risk by exposing myself. I had no intention of making it any worse.
He leans forward on the bed, resting his elbows on his knees, his smile completely gone.
But the way he looked at me, Steve, I couldn't understand why a kid would be so thrilled to spend time with someone like me, but he was. And he kept coming around. And every time he did, I got so caught up in trying to figure out why that I didn't realize I had really started to care about him.
What about his parents? Steve asked. What happened to them?
I wanted to know that too.
Bucky replies, wistful.
It was coming over so often that I started thinking his parents were either absent or didn't give a shit. It would explain why he was so eager to spend time with me.
Guilt wells up in him then, remembering how he used to distrust Peter. He used to think the kid could possibly have ulterior motives when the truth is so much worse.
When I finally asked him,
Bucky stops, the memory making his chest feel tight, hating even thinking about how hard Peter had cried in his arms that night.
I found out that his parents died in a plane crash when he was little, and his aunt and uncle who took him in had just been shot and killed a few months ago. I found out he'd been bounced around between foster homes and abused, and thanks to his mutation and his healing factor, he couldn't make anyone take him seriously. So he finally ran away and had been living out of his school when I met him.
That's awful, Steve says, the sympathy clear as day in his voice. He looks a little torn, like half of him wants to agree that Bucky did the right thing, and the other half refusing to. That's a lot for a kid to take.
Yeah,
says Bucky.
And I kept wondering when it was going to be too much for him, but he just kept going. He became Spider-Man, spent his time helping total strangers when he wasn't hard at work at school, and he always did it with a smile on his face, and I realized he's probably the strongest person I've ever met.
You really love him, Steve says, realizing. Bucky meets his eyes, wanting him to see the sincerity of his words.
Yeah, and I want to be better for him. How could I let myself fall apart when Peter didn't? I didn't want him to have to carry everything by himself anymore. So I stepped up.
He smiles again, warm, a small inkling of satisfaction settling within him at the slightly speechless look on Steve's face.
So, I took a job. Started working as a mechanic for this older couple who owns a small dealership. They fell in love with Peter even faster than I did, and things were really good. I worked, Peter went to school, and in the evenings we'd train and Peter would do his patrol to Spider-Man. We had all these little traditions, like making dinner together and walking this lady's dogs on Saturday, and stopping at our favorite sandwich shop when we didn't feel like cooking. I can't explain what that normalcy did for me. I'd never felt like a human before.
Something changes in Steve then. His body goes a little tense, but his face is open and full of confusion, on the brink of understanding, so Bucky doubles down, needing him to finally get it.
I never wanted anything, Steve. I wasn't living, I was just keeping my body alive and running from Hydra. And I thought that was enough, but Peter made me want more. When I look at him, all I can think about is all the things I want to give him, the life I want him to have. We started referring to each other as father and son when people found out we were living together, but I started thinking of him as my kid long before that.
And you never... Steve starts, trailing off, waiting until Bucky turns and looks at him again before he continues. You never thought about reaching out to me. Not once. Bucky gives him a remorseful look, knowing the answer the man is looking for isn't the one he can give him.
Once,
he said, apologetic.
Peter suddenly came down with a fever that wouldn't break no matter what I did. I couldn't take him to the hospital, and it got so bad I thought he was going to die. I was just about to bring you and the rest of the Avengers down on us, even if it meant letting you arrest me, when he finally came through.
You thought I would arrest you? Steve asks, visibly surprised. He looks maybe a little offended, but Bucky simply pins him with a look and says,
Steve, the last time I saw you, I shot you.
The last time you saw me, he replies, you pulled me out of that river.
Yeah, and I didn't know why. I knew even less about how you'd react if we ever saw each other again.
Well, for the record, this, Steve gestures around them, lips pulling up on a small smile, is not at all how I was expecting it to go. Bucky laughs, unable to help it. The ridiculousness of this truly bizarre day sinking in.
Yeah, that makes two of us.
A moment passes between them, quiet but not awkward. Bucky starts to feel the long hours of the day take their toll on his body, and though he died before admitting it, part of him is looking forward to sleeping in an actual bed, as Stark put it. He feels the need for sleep creep into his muscles, the heaviness settle around his eyes. I want to help you, Steve says, restoring him to wakefulness. Bucky turns and looks at him, regards him closely, on edge. He hates that a small part of him expects Steve to say, but only if you let Peter go. The Steve he knows never would. But neither one of them are really the man they once knew. After we find out who was responsible for Vienna and why they framed you, Steve continues, I want to help clear your name, get that Hydra programming out of your head somehow.
Let me make this clear,
Bucky calmly says.
I'm willing to cooperate. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. But I'm not changing my mind about giving Peter up, and he's my first priority. He comes first, do you understand?
Yeah, Steve says, and the small smile he gives him almost gives Bucky a reason to believe him. I hear you, Buck. I'm on your side. If you say it's Peter first, then it's Peter first. Steve tentatively puts his hand on his shoulder, squeezes, such a familiar and simultaneously alien thing. Bucky meets his eyes and searches them, wondering if Steve feels it too, if he finds this moment somehow reminiscent and foreign at the same time. But Steve expels that thought by patting him again and saying, his voice full of promise, I'm with you till the end of the line. He holds Bucky's gaze, so like Steve, trying to show he means it. Both of you. Bucky wants, against every anxious nerve in his body, to believe him, so he gives a small nod and lets his guard down slightly, his shoulders relaxing, his metal fist unclenching against his leg.
Okay.
Exhaustion pulls him under quickly, but the sleep is light and fitful for most of the night. Bucky wakes up several times and glances at the white sofa, his heart constricting each time he sees it bare, before he remembers where they are, that Peter is sleeping soundly in the next room. He tosses and turns, dozing for only a short few minutes at a time, before he notices the sun beginning to rise behind the sheer white curtains framing the window, and can't lie down any longer. He has to admit the view is amazing from his room. Dense trees fence around a heavily landscaped backyard that stretches down to the water's edge, and the lake is so vast and dark in the early morning light that Bucky can hardly see the shore on the other side. There are birds floating in circles by the dock, with heads bowed like they're still sleeping. No one awake yet in this remote corner of the world except Bucky. He fails. Mist crawls along the top of the water in smoky white clouds, making everything seem cold. Hope Peter's warm enough, he thinks, eager to suddenly go and check. He makes it to the outside of Peter's door before he thinks better of it. They had a long day yesterday, and it's early, and he wants him to get as much sleep as he can. He needs it. Back home, it wouldn't matter if Bucky checked on him while he was asleep. They shared their lives in 2 rooms. But here, behind a closed door in a ghostly quiet room, far from civilization, the slightest noise will probably wake Peter up, and Bucky doesn't want to disturb him by opening the door to check. He decides instead to take another look around the estate, taking note of every vantage point from every window. The house is eerily silent in a cold, dormant way. Bucky strains to hear a single sound, but there's nothing, not even the creak of a bed. He almost heads to Peter's room again, but before he knows it, his legs have taken him outside of Steve's door. It's a little surprising that Steve isn't awake yet, although for all he knows, maybe he is. Steve could be awake, lying there restlessly the way Bucky had, his mind going a mile a minute trying to figure out what to do. Bucky can't bring himself to feel sympathetic. Steve's always been like this, always taken personal responsibility for things that just aren't his business, ever since they were kids. It doesn't surprise him that Steve would feel accountable for his actions, like he would take it upon himself to keep Bucky safe from the world, and the world safe from Bucky, like he has a right to intervene in the things he feels need intervention under the umbrella excuse of, it's the right thing to do. But he knows it's not really that simple either. This is more than Steve wanting to protect an innocent man, and if the situation were reversed, he would probably be trying to keep things under control for Steve, just like Steve is for him. He knows it's cynical to disregard what they mean to each other, and if Steve knew that Bucky doesn't even really consider them friends anymore, it would probably crush him. The guilt of that thought takes him away from the closed door out of the hallway. He passes by another large window and sees that the sun has risen a little higher, and the mist is breaking up over the lake, bringing a hint of more warmth to the world. He decides to make himself useful and heads to the kitchen to get a head start on breakfast, intending to make Peter eat as much as he can when the kid wakes up. He didn't eat enough yesterday after all, and Bucky always starts to feel trapped in his own skin when he thinks of his kid going hungry. He eyes the contents of the fridge with no small amount of suspicion. Stark has been weirdly generous since the moment they got here, and the fully stocked shelves of more food than Bucky can even catalog is just another warning bell ringing in his head. It would be one thing if the man seemed wary or nervous of them and was trying to buy their cooperation, but he doesn't, save for yesterday when Bucky leaned over him and got in his face. Stark seems more annoyed by his presence than afraid of it. So the fact that he would treat them like guests and not prisoners is unsettling, to say the least. What motive or angle could he possibly have? If Hydra is really dismantled like Steve claims, it's not like Bucky has a wealth of valuable information to hand over. Could it have something to do with the Accords? Could Stark be trying to lure them into a false sense of security so he can use them as leverage in his negotiations? Or use them against Steve? If the news reports Peter and Ned have been talking about were correct, then Steve has been pretty vocally against signing anything since the King of Wakanda proposed the idea. Maybe Stark has seen this whole thing from the moment Bucky was framed as an opportunity to change Steve's mind or force his hand? Bucky sighs and turns the element on, preparing to cook the large meal. The theory seems wrong, even to him. There's definitely something devious about Tony Stark, but the idea that he would be masterminding some insidious plot to blackmail Steve, of all people, just seems ridiculous. There is a chance, of course, that the man is just trying, in his own way, to be genuinely nice and accommodating, but that doesn't fit either. He has no reason to treat a terrorist like him with this level of hospitality. So if his motives are neither good nor evil, what are they? Bucky stops in the midst of frying the bacon. Maybe this isn't about him at all. Maybe Bucky has absolutely nothing to do with it, and all of this, from the moment he saw them in the shipping yard, has been about Peter. Nausea fills his stomach. Stark had known about Spider-Man, had addressed Peter directly every single time he showed them any level of welcoming, from describing this place to their bedrooms to the food and even his lab. He had presented all of that to Peter, not Bucky. But why? What could he possibly be after that would make him offer not once, but twice to take Peter in? A flurry of horrible dark thoughts fills his head. Stark could be after anything, and none of them are good. He could want a prodigal son of his own, a genius and a hero, to be the heir of everything he's built. He could want a new Avenger, someone to join the team, to idolize and follow him. Or he could want... Bucky steps away from the hot stove and lets his arm whir and flex out the agitation building within it. A moment of cold dread washes over him that instantly spikes into blinding hot fury, making his head spin and his teeth clench. The rational part of his brain pipes up and says that he has no idea if it's true, that Stark could just be an overly friendly weirdo who likes kids, that Peter is small and frightened, and maybe the man is just doing his best to make things as easy as possible for him, but the rest of him, the fiercely protective side, is already thrumming with a violent urge unlike anything he's ever known, unlike anything any side of him has ever known. I'll kill him, Bucky thinks, frightened that he means it, how easily that thought entered his mind. He doesn't know this part of himself. Was the old Bucky Barnes this violently protective, or is this new? Is this a symptom of the things Hydra had done, or was he always capable of this kind of anger? What would Peter think if he found out that his dad had, for a moment, been so overwhelmed by the urge to kill his childhood hero that it left him lightheaded? Bucky tries to take a deep breath, broken from his thoughts at the loud snap on the sizzling bacon behind him, drawing him back to the present, to the warm, bright kitchen, the smell of food, the sun beaming down on the sky blue lake stretched beyond the window, the green of the forest, the chorus of birds singing. He tries to focus on all that, to let the rage go, let the anxiety seep away as he focuses on here, now. Trampling down on the anger and the fear, Bucky finishes cooking breakfast pretty much on autopilot, not letting his thoughts drift from his actions, his movements. When everything is ready, he covers the plates to keep them warm and heads down the hall to wake Peter. He raps softly on the door, gently calling, "Pete, you awake?" No answer comes, so Bucky knocks again a little louder. "Hey, kid, time to get up. Breakfast is ready." There's still not a sound, so Bucky frowns and grabs the doorknob, offering up a slight warning of, "I'm coming in," before opening the door. The emptiness of the bed hits him instantly, sloppily made, like Peter didn't do much more than pull the comforter back up to the pillows. "Peter," he calls, looking to the door leading to the ensuite bathroom and seeing the door open, the light off. Bucky looks up to the ceiling, not bothering to waste time searching for the little black communication box for the house's AI. "Where's Peter?" "He is in the basement with Mr. Stark." Heart thundering, Bucky forces himself with every fiber of his being to keep calm as he demands, "Doing what?" The full second of silence before she answers only inflames him. "I have been instructed not to tell you." Bucky bolts for the stairs, his left arm shaking, his vision red. The door to the lab is shut, but Bucky can hear Peter's voice inside, can hear the quiet lilt of him speaking. It does nothing to deter him as he throws the door open, his hand crushing the metal handle like Buddy. Both Peter and Stark turn and fix him with wide-eyed stares, and the anger and fear settles in him somewhat when he sees them sitting a good distance apart, a table between them, merely talking. "Peter," he says immediately, unable to keep the distress out of his tone. "Are you okay?" Peter raises an eyebrow at him questioningly and glances down at himself confused. "Yeah?" he half says, half asks, clearly not comprehending why Bucky would ask, before he looks back up at them and his eyes widen slightly. "Are you okay?" Bucky eyes them a moment longer, letting the realization sink in that it's not what he thought, that everything's all right. "Yeah," he says, his nerves fried, leaving Peter looking unconvinced. "Breakfast's ready. Go up and eat before it gets cold." Okay," Peter says, and he looks back at Stark and smiles at him, warm and genuine. There's a large paper bag on the table in front of him, and Peter lifts it and tucks it protectively under his arm as he stands. "Thanks again, Mr. Stark." "No problem, kid," Stark replies, his shoulders a little tense, his hands fidgeting on the table. "You're welcome to come down here whenever you like." Peter grins, clearly excited, totally missing the heated glare Bucky pins the man with. "That would be great!" he says, then walks over to Bucky, bag in hand, already ready to talk his ear off. "Dad, this place is amazing! It's way more advanced than the robotics lab at school! Ned would totally freak out if he was here!" "I'm sure he would," Bucky says, nodding his head toward the stairs. "Go on, off you go." The kid's face falls slightly, and Bucky feels a pinch of guilt, hating to shrug him off like that. "Aren't you coming too?" Bucky looks up, catches Stark's gaze, and holds it. "In a minute," he says. "Okay," Peter says again, sending Stark another grateful smile before he leaves the lab and begins climbing the stairs. Bucky releases the crushed doorknob and silently closes the door behind him. "Peter tells me you're quite the handyman," Stark says, eyeing him flippantly. "Which I hope is true, because otherwise I'm going to bill you for that." "I'd be less concerned about your house and more concerned about your skeleton if I were you," Bucky replies coldly. "Excuse me." Bucky moves forward, watching the man tense the closer he gets, until he's standing on the other side of the table with his palms flat against it. Stark leans back, trying desperately to look unaffected, but his legs cross and his fingers drum against the tabletop even quicker. "I've been trying to figure out what you want," Bucky says quietly, his tone steady and cold, his gaze even more so. "Racking my brain to understand what it is you want from my kid.
And I gotta be honest, no matter what conclusion I come to, it isn't good.
He leans a little closer, his left hand coming up to grab the man's shoulder when he tries to lean back, holding him still, letting him feel the grip and pressure of his hand.
I hope it goes without saying,
Bucky copies him,
that if you ever touch that kid, Stark, there isn't enough money, technology, or superhuman strength on this planet to save you from me.
He tightens his grip, watches the man's face lift in pain.
I will kill you. Don't forget that.
The pain on the man's face is muddled somewhat by something else, something that gives Bucky a moment's pause, trying to make sense of it. Beneath the pain, Stark looks surprised, and not in the way he had when Bucky barged in on them. The surprise turns to confusion for a second, and then to Bucky's bewilderment becomes offense! What the fuck? Stark says, batting his hand off his shoulder. Bucky lets him. Are you seriously giving me the shovel talk right now? Bucky frowns.
What are you talking about?
What are you talking about? Stark stands up, looking so genuinely insulted that Bucky's train of thought derails. I'm risking my neck to keep your cyborg ass out of a Wakandan prison, and this is my thanks.
What did you expect me to think?
Bucky says, standing up straight, feeling chastised by the other men's anger at ridiculous for it.
You've been really invested in him since you laid eyes on him. You kept offering to take him in, and then you stuck him down here and told your robot butler not to tell me why. That doesn't seem suspicious as fuck to you.
Maybe to you, Stark says, not contentiously, holding his hands up in surrender. But I'm on the other side of that, Barnes. You think my actions seem suspicious to you. How do you think yours seem to me?
What?
Stark looks at him flatly and gestures to the door as if Peter was still standing there. I've been looking for that kid for days, and when I find him, it's with an internationally wanted terrorist assassin who, at best, isn't able to control his actions 100% of the time. He holds up a hand, starts listing things off, counting them with his fingers. In the less than 24 hours I've been observing you, I've seen you get violently protective, although I'm more inclined to call it possessive. I've seen you guys cuddle way more than any teenager should want to with an adult they've only known for a year. I've watched him display more than enough signs of anxiety to label it disorder, not to mention the fact that he's clearly had his growth stunted. I know you guys shared a studio apartment straight out of a horror movie, and on top of all that, he seems completely dependent on you.
He's my kid,
Bucky argues, offended, though Stark hasn't even really accused him of anything yet.
Of course he's dependent on me.
Stark eyes him, calculating. You seem pretty dependent on him too.
What are you saying here exactly?
The calmness in his own voice surprises him.
Yeah, we're closer than normal families, and we take comfort in each other probably a lot more than normal families do, but that kid's been through a lot. You have no idea what Peter survived.
Yeah, Tony says.
I do.
Bucky's eyes narrow, his posture defensive in spite of himself.
If you knew as much as you say you do, you would know that Peter isn't in danger with me.
The man's face changes slightly, looking almost, to Bucky's confusion, remorseful. I do know that, he says softly prideful, seemingly forcing himself to meet Bucky's eyes.
Now, what?
Tony sighs, withdrawing, moving away from the table, over to a desk with a holographic monitor on top. I don't think you're dangerous for him, he says reluctantly, like he can't stand to admit that he was wrong.
I was quick to judge.
Bucky can't keep the surprise out of his voice.
That's not much of an apology.
The man turns and fixes him with a wide, disbelieving look. Hi! You just accused me of being an actual monster. Where's my apology? He, honest to God, presses his hand to his chest dramatically, and Bucky is physically incapable of stopping himself from smirking, as well as the whole aforementioned keeping you out of jail and probably from being executed thing. A little gratitude would be nice.
I'll thank you for your hospitality when you stop trying to take away my kid,
Bucky tells him honestly, bringing the tone of the conversation back to a more serious one.
And when you tell me why the hell you're so interested in him.
Tony's expression tenses like he's trying to control it and failing. He drops his gaze, rubs the back of his neck in shame or embarrassment or both, and says, I was going to adopt him.
What?
For a moment, the man doesn't speak, like he's fighting with himself to work out the nerve. He fidgets again, then sighs, stuffing his hands into his pockets. Spider-Man, he says again, not clarifying anything. He pulls out his phone at Bucky's confused expression and displays a holographic screen, thumbing over the buttons until the video starts to play. Bucky's heart stops watching the looping footage of Peter that day he caught that bus, landing in front of it just in time, taking the full weight of it. The video stops just before Bucky bursts out of that crowd running over to him, and he can't tell by Tony's face if he knows about it or not. When I saw this video, I thought, damn, that kid has some skills. So I asked Friday to start saving anything she could find relating to this Spider-Man in case we ever needed his help. He closes the video and puts the phone away, his back still tense. When this whole Accords crap started, I casually remarked that maybe it was time to bring Spider-Man into the mix, and Friday told me he hadn't been seen in months. Tony eyes him then, not unkindly but severely, and I got worried. Kinda beat myself up a little bit over the fact that I hadn't bothered to check in sooner. It didn't take that much investigating to figure out his secret identity. He grins at Barnes, teasing. For a smart kid, he never realized there are more than enough cameras in alleyways and on rooftops. Got enough footage of him slipping his mask off to compile a profile, and then the database did all the work. Bucky sighs, resisting the urge to drop his face into his hands, and the other man widens his grin at him before composing himself. Once I had a name, I started looking at his history and... Tony trails off, his gaze lost in the middle distance. Well, being an orphan myself, I admit I had a soft spot for him pretty much right away. Regarding him, Bucky sinks down into the chair Peter had occupied before listening. I felt compelled to help him when I read that his parents died. But when I saw that his aunt and uncle had died too, and that he was in the system, well... Tony hoists himself up to sit on top of his desk, his elbows resting on his knees. I made the call immediately, inquiring what I had to do to apply to adopt him. Why? Bucky asks, unable to help himself. Peter's not the only orphan in New York, and you hadn't even met him yet. Tony smiles, clasping his hands together. Hadn't met him, but I had detailed notes from his school advisors, counselors, past teachers, you name it. The only thing that stuck out was the frankly moronic report his social worker made up, which, to put it lightly, did not paint Peter in a very good light. It was so completely different from everything else everyone else had said about him that I had to look into it. But when I realized that the whole thing was bullshit, and that not only had this kid been orphaned twice, but also abused and called a liar for it, well, I really didn't have a choice but to step in. Step in? The way his social worker should have, Tony explains. I went to every foster home and investigated them myself. It wasn't hard to see the signs of abuse since I actually used my eyeballs. The dryness in the man's voice is humorous somehow, but neither of them laugh. Tony looks tense with anxiety. Bucky feels pulled tight with anger. I made some calls to ensure none of those bastards ever get to come near a child again. But I didn't find Peter. The last time I visited was some kind of creepy boys' home, with this awful old religious lady running it, and she was totally useless. Took 10 minutes of showing her photos of Peter for her to remember she hadn't seen him in over a year. Two things well up in Bucky at the same time. Rage that Peter was ever in the hands of such people in the first place, and relief that he found him when he did. So the only place I had left to look was his school, but this whole thing blew up. Sorry, no pun intended. With us being asked to bring you in, and Steve freaking out and going AWOL. If none of this had happened, I would have shown up at his school and asked him if he wanted to come stay with me. Why? Bucky asks again, still filled with suspicion, despite recognizing the sincerity in the other man's tone. Tony looks at him more honestly than he has up until now, regarding Bucky like he isn't completely put off by his presence for the very first time since they met. I know how tough life is when you don't have family, Tony says like it's killing him to do so. Or worse, when you think you have family but they're only using you. I didn't want that to happen to him. So maybe I find it interesting that a kid could go through that kind of hardship and still be described by everyone around him as a ray of sunshine. Sue me. He shrugs, trying to look nonchalant, but Bucky realizes that something has made Tony feel responsible for Peter in ways he thought no one else could understand. Thought he was worth meeting at the very least. Look, Bucky says, sighing, resting his arm on the table, the weight of the metal beginning to bother him. I get that you're just trying to help, but regardless, trying to separate us is out of line. I don't care how good your intentions are, you're not taking it. The man glares at him, holding out his arms like he's gesturing to the room around him. Does this look like I'm trying to take him? For God's sake, Barnes, your bedrooms are only separated by one wall. You've been pretty vocal that we keep you together, and we have. His defensive scowl deepens, revealing harsh lines on his face that weren't there moments ago. Yes, I offered to look after him. Key word there. Offered. What kind of child-snatching goblin do you take me for?
You seem pretty adamant that he couldn't stay with me yesterday,
Bucky replies, narrowing his own gaze.
You didn't particularly seem to care what either of us wanted so long as you got to do the right thing.
A quality the man seems to share with Steve, infuriatingly. You're constantly one sentence away from killing people against your will. Tony shoots back, but his scowl slips away and a calmer, almost compassionate look takes its place. Forgive me if I thought leaving a child in your care wasn't such a great idea yesterday. Bucky blinks, his eyebrows furrowing.
Yesterday.
Yeah, well, Bucky says quickly, hopping down off the desk and stretching his back, fidgeting. Like I said, quick to judge. Don't get me wrong, you need professional help before I'll be completely comfortable letting you bury the kid. But getting you that help is at least something I can do. Probably. He lets a moment of silence pass between them, then asks,
What did Peter say that changed your mind?
It wasn't what Peter said, Tony says. It's what you said.
What I said.
Last night, he clarifies. Sorry, yeah, I was listening. Again, assuming I'm just trying to be diligent about letting an assassin run loose around my house. Anyway, I heard you give Peter a choice to get out of this whole thing, and I realized something.
What's that?
Bucky asks. Tony looks down at the floor, stalling his answer, and when he looks back up and meets his gaze, his face is filled with a startling amount of emotion. There are lots of kids out there who don't have parents that love them, he says. I'm not about to take one away from a parent who does. By the time Bucky leaves the basement and heads back upstairs, he is not sure how to feel about their imprisonment in this strange place and their even stranger imprisoner. Part of him still deeply distrusts the man and his supposed good intentions, but another part, a somewhat incensant part, had been sort of, well, for lack of a better word, charmed by his bluntness and his seemingly genuine desire to help. You can see why Steve likes and trusts him so much, for whatever that's worth. But he still doesn't know how he really feels about either of them. Steve seemed more open to changing his mind after realizing how good Peter is for Bucky, and Tony seemed more open to changing his mind after realizing how good Bucky is for Peter, and he knows he should be grateful for that, but he can't bring himself to let his guard down, not completely. There's too much anxiety still, too much protective fear, telling him to be ready every second for the other shoe to drop, to have a plan to take Peter and run at the first sign of trouble. That tenseness and anxiety abates for a little while at least, when he turns the corner and sees Peter standing there in the kitchen, bathed head to toe in the sunlight streaming in from the large open windows. There's something about it that makes him look safe, wrapped in light like this, fiddling with the microwave, a peaceful expression on his face. He looks like nothing can hurt him here, and for a moment Bucky lets himself believe that's true.
You didn't eat?
He asks, watching Peter swap the two equally full plates in and out of the microwave. Peter looks at him over his shoulder and smiles a little embarrassed and says, yeah, sorry. I wanted to wait for you.
It won't taste as good reheated,
Bucky says, though it's too late to do anything about that now, he supposes. Shouldn't have taken so long then, Peter teases, laughing and ducking out of the way as Bucky playfully flicks him. They sit down to eat at the large island bar, and Peter wastes no time jumping right into the excited rant he's probably been dying to start since he left the lab. Does Mr. Stark show you his 3D printer? It's way more advanced than the ones we have at school. I swear it's straight out of Star Trek. Ned would go crazy if he got his hands on it. I can only hope he'd use his genius for good.
You guys will have a lot to catch up on when we go home,
Bucky says. Peter smiles, but his shoulders deflate somewhat, and he sighs, looking down at his already empty plate. I wish I could call him. Bucky gently ruffles his hair as he stands and takes the dishes to the sink.
I know, kiddo. I wish you could too.
Do you think we'll be here a long time? Peter asks as he joins him at the counter and starts helping rinse and dry the dishes while Bucky washes.
I'm not sure,
he replies honestly, feeling his unease creep back in. He glances down at Peter and resists this temptation to bombard him with questions, not wanting him to pick up on Bucky's distrust of their temporary housemates any more than he already has. Regardless of what conflicts may arise between him and Steve and Tony, there's no reason Peter needs to know about any of it. It would only stress him out even more. Bucky sighs and drains the water out of the sink.
Peter,
he begins reluctantly, drying off his hands.
Look, I know Stark's been pretty accommodating and generous, and he's helped us out in a tight spot, but I want you to know you don't have to do anything he says.
I know, Peter says, following his lead and wiping his own hands. I already told him I'm not going with him.
Bucky flinches, surprised. You did?
He says, Peter nodding.
What did he say?
Peter grins then, wide, bright, and excited, and he bends down and picks up the paper bag he left resting against the counter and holds it open for Bucky with an overjoyed, "He gave me this!" Bucky peeks into the bag.
What is it?
One sec! Peter turns and dashes for the hallway. I'll show you! It takes a minute, but then Peter steps out of the mouth of the hallway, back into the room, and Bucky stands up straight and looks him over with wide, astonished eyes.
Holy crap, kid. Look at you.
Right? Peter says, and Bucky can hear the grin in his voice, but he can't see it beneath his red mask, skin tight like the rest of the suit, red and blue with a faint webbed design and large wide eyes that are utterly fitting for the name Spider-Man.
He made you that?
Yep, Peter says, pulling the mask up to his forehead, and he looks so genuinely happy that it startles Bucky. He looks at home in the suit, comforted, like he belongs with it. Isn't it awesome? It's so high-tech. I want a web sling around so badly.
Ceilings are high enough in here. Bucky jokes. Seriously though, Peter, it looks good on you. About time you had an upgrade.
He smiles, but feels a touch of insecurity blooming in his chest. He never would have been able to gift Peter something like this.
No more poorly sewn sleeve extensions for you.
Peter laughs and finishes pulling his mask off, then stops and glances behind Bucky. Bucky turns and follows the line of his gaze, sees Steve standing there watching them. The man smiles and enters the room with a polite, "Good morning."
"Morning,"
Bucky says, feeling weird about it as soon as it leaves his mouth. Steve comes up beside him and stops, observing Peter curiously. "New suit?" "Oh, yeah," Peter says, nervous. "Mr. Stark gave it to me." Surprise colored Steve's face.
"When? Just now?"
Peter nods, and Bucky's about to tell him to go change, to give him a way out so he can calm his nerves, when Steve smiles again and asks, "Well then, how about we have a little sparring match so you can try it out?"